What if the most dangerous intelligence operation ever run against the West was not a hack, not a spy ring, not a stolen weapons file? What if it was a party? What if the most powerful men in the world, senators, presidents, prime ministers, royalty, walked willingly into a building owned by a man they believed was their friend, sat in rooms they believed were private, and never once noticed the camera hidden inside the smoke detector above their heads? What if that camera was not his? What if it never was? There is a concept in intelligence tradecraft called a non-official cover asset, a person who is not formally on the payroll of any agency, who carries no badge, holds no title, appears in no organizational chart, who operates in the open with a constructed identity so convincing that the people around him never ask the right question. The right question is not, "Who is this man?" The right question is, who built him? His name was Jeffrey Epstein. He arrived in New York in the mid-1970s with no college degree, no family money, no obvious qualification for the world he intended to enter. Within a decade, he was managing the finances of billionaires. Within 2 decades, he owned a private island, a 9-floor Manhattan mansion, a ranch in New Mexico, a Paris apartment, and a Boeing 727 that carried the most powerful people on Earth between all of them. Nobody could fully explain the money. Nobody could fully explain the access. Nobody, for 20 years, asked why a man with no verifiable clients and no auditable revenue had accumulated the infrastructure of a small government. They should have asked, because the answer was not about money at all. This is the story of how Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, allegedly designed, funded, and operated one of the most sophisticated blackmail networks in the history of modern espionage. How they used a constructed billionaire as their front. How they hid cameras in the most exclusive rooms in the world. How they collected secrets from the people who run governments, shape policy, and decide the fate of nations. And how, when it was finally over, the evidence of what they had done was locked inside 9 hard drives that the United States federal government has held for 6 years, and whose contents it has still not disclosed. The operation did not begin with Jeffrey Epstein. It began with his predecessor. Robert Maxwell was one of the most powerful media moguls of the 20th century, a Czech-born Holocaust survivor who built an international publishing empire spanning newspapers, academic journals, and television stations across 3 continents. He was eccentric, he was feared. He had the ear of prime ministers. He was also, according to multiple former intelligence officials and subsequent investigative reporting, a long-running asset of the Mossad. This is not a fringe allegation. Viktor Ostrovsky, a former Mossad case officer who wrote 2 books about his service, described Maxwell's role within the intelligence network in detail. Ari Ben-Menash, who claims to have worked for Israeli military intelligence from 1977 to 1987, states that he personally served as Robert Maxwell's handler, that Maxwell was a recruited agent who moved money, gathered intelligence, and provided cover for Israeli operations across Europe and the United States for decades. When Maxwell died in November 1991, found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near his yacht, in circumstances that a Spanish judge initially ruled as neither accident nor suicide, his funeral was held on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. 6 Israeli prime ministers attended. The heads of both Israeli intelligence services were present. Shimon Peres delivered the eulogy. These are not the people who attend a businessman's funeral. They are the people who attend the funeral of an asset, of someone whose silence, in death, needed to be honored, and whose network needed to be absorbed. Robert Maxwell left behind a daughter. Ghislaine Maxwell had grown up inside the intersection of money, media, and intelligence operations. She had watched her father move between those worlds since childhood. She understood, viscerally, how access worked, how a relationship cultivated over years could be converted, at the right moment, into something that had nothing to do with friendship. When her father died, the public fortune was largely gone. The empire had been built on fraudulently borrowed money, and the creditors came quickly, but the connections remained. and according to Ben Menashe's account, detailed in his book Epstein, Dead Men Tell No Tales, what Ghislaine inherited from her father was not merely a social network. It was a role. Ben Menashe states that Robert Maxwell had introduced both Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein to the Mossad before his death, that the operation that followed was not something Epstein or Ghislaine constructed independently. It was an assignment. They were recruited assets given a specific operational mandate: build relationships with the most powerful men in the Western world, create situations in which those men could be recorded in compromising circumstances, and produce intelligence and leverage that would serve Israeli strategic interests. Jeffrey Epstein, in this framing, was not the architect of the operation. He was the face of it. He was chosen or constructed for a specific reason. He had the right profile: financially ambitious, socially hungry, intelligent enough to perform in elite company but not so independently powerful that he would become difficult to manage. He had no family wealth that would make him resistant to financial dependency. He had no institutional loyalty that would give him a reason to refuse. He was, in the assessment of whoever made the decision, the right instrument for what needed to be built. Stephen Hoffenberg, who ran a Ponzi scheme alongside Epstein in the 1980s and served 18 years in federal prison for it while Epstein was never charged, gave interviews before his death in 2022 that fill in some of this picture. Hoffenberg said that Epstein frequently referenced his Mossad connections, not as a secret, but as a source of pride, as an explanation for why certain things that should have gone wrong for him did not. He said Epstein had been taught a method called playing the box, a system of simultaneously extracting money, information, and compromising material from the same targets, ensuring they could never retaliate without destroying themselves. Hoffenberg did not describe this as something Epstein invented. He described it as something Epstein was taught. The financial infrastructure that made the cover credible came from a single source. Les Wexner was the founder of Victoria's Secret and one of the wealthiest men in America. His connection to Epstein has never been satisfactorily explained. At some point in the late 1980s, Wexner gave Epstein full power of attorney over his personal finances, a level of trust that virtually no financial advisor in history has been granted by a client of that magnitude. He then transferred to Epstein a 9-floor townhouse on East 71st Street in Manhattan, one of the largest private residences in New York City, valued at $77 million. He transferred it for a sum of approximately zero. Wexner was also a founding member of a group called the Mega Group, an organization of exclusively Jewish billionaires, established in 1991. Dedicated to funding Jewish causes and pro-Israel political interests in the United States. The timing of the group's founding and the overlap between its membership and the network that surrounded Epstein has been noted by multiple investigators. Wexner later said he felt he had been deceived by Epstein. What he did not explain was how a man of his sophistication and resources had been deceived into transferring a $77 million property and complete financial authority to someone he had known for a few years. By the early 1990s, the infrastructure was in place. The Manhattan townhouse, the Palm Beach estate, the private island, Little St. James, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, purchased in 1998 for under $8 million, and developed into a compound with multiple structures, a private airstrip, and accommodation for dozens of guests. The Boeing 727, which became the primary vehicle for moving high-value targets between locations, and in every property, concealed inside ordinary objects, smoke detectors, Kleenex boxes, decorative frames, electronic equipment, a network of motion-activated cameras, hidden cameras, pointed at beds, at sofas, at the rooms where powerful men, relaxed, comfortable, believing themselves among friends, did the things that powerful men do when they believe they are not being watched. Former employees later confirmed to investigators that cameras operated around the clock at the Palm Beach estate. Every room. 24 hours a day. Emails recovered from 2014 show Epstein personally directing a staff member to install concealed cameras in his home, specifying the objects they should be hidden inside and the angles they should cover. When FBI agents executed a search warrant on the Manhattan townhouse in 2019, they found 9 Seagate hard drives, nude photographs, voice recorders, audio-video equipment, envelopes containing large sums of cash. 9 hard drives from one property. The question investigators have never been able to fully answer, or have been unwilling to answer publicly, is where the recordings on those drives went. Not all of them, not necessarily even most of them. Where the copies went. Because an intelligence operation that holds leverage does not keep its leverage in one place. It does not store its most valuable material in a building that can be searched, in drives that can be seized, in a location that can be raided by the same government whose officials appear on them. The Mossad has been running intelligence operations for decades. They know where to keep the things that matter. The 9 hard drives in federal custody may be what was left behind deliberately. The question is what was removed before anyone arrived. The operation did not begin with cameras. It began with a party. That is how every honey trap begins. Not with hardware, not with technology, not with any of the infrastructure that comes later. It begins with a room full of people who believe they have been invited because they are exceptional, because someone important has noticed them, because they have, in some invisible but meaningful way, arrived. Epstein understood this better than almost anyone because he had been trained to understand it. The vulnerability of powerful people is not money, it is not fear. It is the need to be in the room where decisions are made. The need to have that position confirmed repeatedly by the company they keep. Give them the room. Make them feel at home in it. And then give them a reason to return. The guest list Epstein assembled across 2 decades represents something unprecedented in the history of intelligence operations. A former U.S. president flew on his private jet. A sitting British royal was photographed inside his townhouse. The MIT Media Lab director, the director of the Council on Foreign Relations, prominent senators, federal judges, foreign heads of state, the flight logs, pages of names, dates, and destinations that entered public record through civil litigation, document not single visits but repeated ones, men who came back, men who brought others, men who had made, at some point, the decision that the room was worth being in, regardless of what they suspected about the room. This is the mechanism that intelligence professionals call social proof. The most powerful recruitment tool that exists precisely because it requires no recruitment at all. The target convinces himself. He looks around, sees who else is there, decides that men of that caliber would not be present if the environment were dangerous, and stays. The cameras record everything he does while he stays. Alongside the social network, Epstein constructed a parallel identity as an intellectual patron. He donated to Harvard, to MIT, to research institutions across the country. He created named positions at universities. He funded scientific conferences and private gatherings of academics working in genetics, artificial intelligence, and materials science, areas with direct national security implications. This layer of the operation served multiple purposes. It gave Epstein a cover story for his inexplicable wealth. A man funding cutting-edge scientific research has an obvious public interest justification for accumulating resources. It gave the operation access to a category of intelligence that has never received adequate attention in the public discussion of this case. Not political leverage, not policy influence, scientific intelligence. The informal knowledge of where specific research programs stood, what barriers remained, what breakthroughs were close. The kind of intelligence that does not appear in any briefing, but that shapes what a country is able to develop and when. Several of the academics connected to Epstein's funding network worked on research with classified or dual-use applications. Whether the connections produced specific intelligence transfers has never been publicly established, but the pattern was there. And patterns in intelligence work are not coincidences. They are signatures. Virginia Giuffre was young when Ghislaine Maxwell approached her at Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, where she worked as a changing room attendant. Maxwell told her she could work as a massage therapist for a wealthy and well-connected man who could advance her career. What followed, documented across years of legal proceedings, deposition testimony, and civil litigation, was the human cost of what the camera system required. The operation needed more than recording equipment. It needed people who could ensure that the men being recorded were in a position to be recorded. It needed a supply chain of young women, recruited from economically vulnerable circumstances, who would be placed in Epstein's orbit and used to create the situations the cameras were positioned to capture. Giuffre testified that she was trafficked to powerful men, a British royal, a prominent American attorney, and others, on Epstein's instruction. She identified these men by name in legal proceedings. She went to the FBI with her account in 2005, more than a decade before Epstein was arrested. She was not the only one. Palm Beach police identified more than 30 additional victims in the course of their 2005 investigation. There is a detail that did not receive significant attention at the time of the 2005 investigation, but that intelligence analysts have since examined with care. Among the items found in Epstein's Palm Beach safe during the initial police search was a passport. Not his primary passport, a second passport. Foreign, Austrian, according to one investigative account, issued under a different name, with a photograph of Epstein, listing his residence as Saudi Arabia, a working false identity document, in a safe, in the home of a man who described himself as a financial advisor. This is not a wealthy eccentric's affectation. This is not the kind of item that people accumulate casually. This is operational infrastructure, the kind of document you carry when you need to move across borders in a capacity that your real identity cannot explain. No explanation for the passport was ever made public. No charge related to it was ever filed. It was found, documented, and then, for the purposes of the public record, effectively set aside. The FBI opened an investigation in 2005. Palm Beach detectives built a case across months of interviews, corroborating witness statements, phone records, and physical evidence. The documentation was substantial. By any standard assessment, it was sufficient for a federal prosecution that would have carried decades of prison exposure. The case was referred to federal prosecutors in Florida. And then, in 2008, U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta entered into a non-prosecution agreement with Epstein's legal team that has no clear parallel in federal criminal history. Epstein pleaded to 2 state-level charges. He served 13 months in county jail. He was permitted to leave the facility 6 days a week for up to 12 hours at a time, returning at night, an arrangement that his own victims' advocates later established he used to continue the activity for which he had been prosecuted. The federal charges were dropped entirely. The agreement was sealed from public view. The victims were not notified, in apparent violation of federal law. When the agreement became public a decade later, through the journalism of Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald, and when Acosta was called before the press as U.S. Secretary of Labor to explain it, a reporter present at one briefing reported that Acosta said he had been told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. Acosta denied making that statement, but the outcome of the agreement was entirely consistent with it. Because what the 2008 deal represents, when you strip away the procedural language and look at the structural reality, is a determination by a United States attorney that a particular defendant existed in a category for which the normal application of federal law did not apply. Someone made that determination. Someone communicated it, explicitly or implicitly, through channels that left no recoverable record. Someone ensured that the walls the legal system builds around ordinary defendants did not close around Jeffrey Epstein. And the person who did that did not do it out of personal affection for Epstein. They did it because of what Epstein held, because of what those cameras had captured, because somewhere in the archive of material his properties had accumulated over 15 years, there were recordings of people for whom a federal prosecution of Jeffrey Epstein would have been catastrophic. The cameras were not just a collection mechanism, they were the shield. The arrest on July 6, 2019, was not the beginning of the end. It was the moment someone decided the end was permissible. Because here is what the 2019 prosecution was built on: the same victims, the same locations, the same documented pattern of behavior that had existed in 2005. The Southern District of New York's indictment contained no evidence that had not been available to Alexander Acosta when he negotiated the 2008 agreement. What had changed was not the evidence. What had changed was the calculation of who, in 2019, the cameras could no longer protect him from. The Southern District had built their case in deliberate isolation from the Florida prosecution infrastructure, away from the U.S. Attorney's Office that had negotiated the original deal, away from the FBI field offices that had, for reasons never publicly explained, allowed that deal to stand unchallenged for a decade. They had Julie Brown's reporting, published in November 2018, which had done what 11 years of sealed agreements had prevented: put the documented account of what happened in Palm Beach in front of a public audience that could not be managed or contained. They had a legal theory that the 2008 non-prosecution agreement bound only the Southern District of Florida, that it had no force in New York. Epstein's lawyers challenged that theory immediately. They filed motions arguing the agreement was nationwide in scope, that prosecuting him in New York violated the deal's terms, that the government was, in effect, reneging on a negotiated settlement. For several weeks, that challenge was substantively alive. One ruling in a different direction, and Epstein walks out of the Metropolitan Correctional Center and boards his plane. The prosecution that appeared decisive was one legal motion away from collapse. Inside the correctional center, the conditions around Epstein created a specific problem that the investigators building the case had not fully accounted for. He was placed on suicide watch. This meant 24-hour observation, a cellmate, regular documented checks. It also meant daily contact with his legal team, communications moving in and out of the facility at a frequency and volume that created, in the assessment of people familiar with the case, opportunities for information to move in directions that the formal monitoring system was not designed to track. What information moved? To whom? Through which intermediaries? This was never established, but the question was present from the first week of his incarceration, and it was never answered. On July 27, 2019, Epstein was removed from suicide watch. The decision was made by prison psychiatrists and documented according to standard protocol. A defendant who had stabilized, who was communicating with counsel, who showed no measurable indicators of acute self-harm risk. Procedurally, the decision was defensible, but in operational terms, the moment the watch was lifted was the moment the conditions surrounding Epstein changed in a way that mattered. He was moved to a different unit. A cellmate was assigned. Then, days later, the cellmate was transferred to another facility. Epstein was alone. The people building the prosecution were not tracking conditions inside the prison. They were focused on the evidentiary challenge, on holding the legal theory together long enough to reach a trial date, assembling witness testimony, cataloging the documentary record, preparing for the argument that the 2008 agreement did not bar their case. They were operating on a specific assumption that the threat to this prosecution was legal, that if they could survive the motions practice and reach trial, the evidence would carry the case. They were wrong about the nature of the threat. The threat was not in a courtroom. It was in the same architecture that had protected Epstein for 20 years, the network of obligation, of knowledge, of people who understood what he held and what a public trial would put in front of a jury. On the night of August 9th into the morning of August 10th, 2 corrections officers assigned to monitor Epstein's unit were supposed to conduct checks every 30 minutes. Both fell asleep. This is the official account. Both officers on the same shift in the same unit, monitoring the highest-profile federal prisoner in the country, fell asleep simultaneously and remained asleep through multiple scheduled check intervals. One of the 2 officers was not a regular MCC assignment. He had been filled in from a different unit under a mandatory overtime arrangement, pressed into service because of chronic understaffing at the facility. The cameras covering Epstein's specific corridor and cell malfunctioned. Not all cameras in the facility, not a system-wide failure. The cameras covering the specific location where Epstein was held, on that specific night. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, the incoming shift arrived to conduct a check. What followed, in the official record, was a procedural delay in the logging of the discovery, a notification that went to the wrong destination before reaching the right one, a response lag that, in the language of the subsequent investigation, reflected a failure of protocols. By the time the formal timestamp was recorded, Epstein had been unresponsive long enough that the paramedics who arrived understood their role was documentation rather than intervention. He was transported to New York Presbyterian Hospital. He was pronounced dead at 6:39 a.m. The New York City medical examiner ruled his death a suicide by hanging. The finding was based on physical evidence consistent with asphyxiation and the absence of evidence establishing another cause. Dr. Michael Baden, hired by Epstein's brother, one of the most credentialed forensic pathologists in the United States, examined the same evidence and reached a different conclusion. He identified fractures in Epstein's neck, to the hyoid bone and to the thyroid cartilage that he stated were more consistent with homicidal strangulation than with self-inflicted hanging. He noted that these specific injuries occur in hanging deaths at a rate of approximately 25%, but in manual strangulation cases at a rate of more than 50%, with the frequency increasing significantly in older men. Baden did not state definitively that Epstein was murdered. He stated that the evidence warranted a more thorough investigation than had been conducted. That investigation was not conducted. The two officers were charged with falsifying prison records, logging checks they had not performed, recording observations they had not made. Neither was charged in connection with Epstein's death. Both reached deferred prosecution agreements. Neither stood trial. The Department of Justice conducted an internal review. Its findings were not published in substantive form. Here is the assumption that the execution phase turned on, and where it broke. Whoever made the decision that Epstein could now be prosecuted, whoever concluded in 2018 or 2019 that the protection had eroded enough to allow the case to proceed, assumed that federal custody was security, that placing Epstein inside a federal detention facility moved him beyond the reach of the network that had protected him. But the network's protection had never depended on Epstein being free. It depended on Epstein never testifying, and testifying requires being alive. The trial that was supposed to open the archive never happened. The names that a jury would have heard, the recordings that prosecutors would have placed into evidence, the chain of decision-making that led from a hidden camera in a smoke detector to a sealed agreement in a federal courthouse, none of it was ever put before a fact-finder in a public proceeding. The man who sat at the operational center of what may be the most consequential intelligence blackmail operation in modern history died alone in a cell, while the cameras that were supposed to watch him did not work. Everything he knew died with him, or it survived him, somewhere the public cannot see. The morning Epstein's death was announced, something happened in the offices of several prominent law firms that represented people whose names had appeared on flight logs and in civil depositions. Not panic, nothing that visible. A quieter adjustment. Lawyers who had been preparing for subpoenas that had not yet arrived understood that certain subpoenas would not arrive. Clients who had been told to prepare documents quietly received calls telling them to stand down. The legal machinery that a trial would have required stopped. Not because anyone ordered it to stop, because the reason for it to run had been removed. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested 11 months later in New Hampshire, at a property purchased under a shell company during the months she had spent moving and going dark. Her arrest was presented as evidence that the investigation had survived Epstein's death. That accountability had not been entirely foreclosed, but the arrest also established something the prosecution did not state publicly. Ghislaine Maxwell was the ceiling. With Epstein gone, Maxwell was the highest point the case could reach. Whatever she knew about the structure above her, whoever had directed the operation, whoever had received the intelligence the cameras produced, whoever had made the calls that resulted in the 2008 agreement, None of that could be extracted through Epstein anymore. Maxwell was tried for what she had done to the victims. She was convicted on 5 counts. She is serving 20 years. She was not tried as an intelligence asset. She was not charged with espionage or with operating on behalf of a foreign power. The question that sits at the center of this entire case, who was she working for, was not put before a jury. It was not permitted to be. In January 2024, a federal court began releasing documents from civil litigation connected to the network. Over successive weeks, more than 1,000 pages were made public. Flight logs cross-referenced with names, deposition transcripts, emails. More than 150 individuals were named across those documents, in contexts ranging from identified passengers to references in victim testimony. The responses were consistent. Denials, statements through lawyers. The assertion that proximity to Epstein did not establish participation in his crimes. Some of those denials were credible. A single visit to a property does not make a man a target or a participant. But the documents showed that the proximity, for a significant number of those named, was not a single visit. It was repeated. It was documented. It spanned years. And for those individuals, regardless of what the cameras captured or did not capture, the permanent uncertainty created by the existence of the recording system is itself the consequence, because they do not know what was recorded. They cannot know what copies exist. They cannot know whether those copies are in the hands of the U.S. government, a foreign intelligence service, or both. They were told it by publicists who issued carefully worded statements describing the women as confused, as motivated by money, as participants in a media campaign orchestrated by people with political agendas. They were told it by the architecture of wealth itself, by the simple reality that when a teenager with no resources and no legal representation makes an accusation against a man with a 9-floor Manhattan mansion and a private Boeing 727, the institutional weight of every system she encounters is already arranged against her. This is not an accident of the Epstein case specifically. It is the design feature that made the Epstein case possible. Virginia Giuffre first reported what had been done to her in 2005. She was 21 years old. She had spent 5 years inside a network that had recruited her at 16 with the promise of career opportunity and had delivered something that had no relationship to opportunity at all. She gave her account to the Palm Beach Police Department. She gave it to the FBI. She gave it to attorneys, to investigators, to journalists. She repeated it across 14 years of legal proceedings in multiple countries, under oath, in depositions, in open court, at significant personal cost. Each time she repeated it, a new mechanism was deployed to discredit it. She was described, in legal filings submitted by attorneys representing men she had accused, as an unreliable witness, as someone with a financial motivation to fabricate, as a person whose account had shifted across tellings in ways that undermined its credibility. The shifts were real, in the way that the accounts of trauma survivors are always real. Not because the core facts changed, but because memory is not a recording, and the lived experience of abuse does not produce consistent linear testimony in the way that legal systems, designed around the testimony of observers rather than survivors, prefer. The lawyers used that reality as a weapon. Maria Farmer was the first victim to report Epstein to the FBI. She made that report in 1996, 23 years before his arrest. She described, in interviews given decades later, what it felt like to have made that report and then watched nothing happen. To have put herself at risk, and she was at risk in ways that were not abstract, by going to law enforcement, and to have received in return the specific silence of an institution that had received her account and decided, for reasons it did not explain to her, not to act on it. She described the years that followed as a form of ongoing punishment for having spoken. Because when powerful men are not held accountable, the people who accused them do not simply return to their previous lives. They live in a world in which the men they accused continue to operate, continue to have resources, and continue to have the ability to make the cost of having spoken feel present and ongoing. The punishment for reporting Jeffrey Epstein, for the women who reported him in the years before his arrest, was years of continued exposure to the network they had tried to escape. There is a specific mechanism by which wealth operates in legal proceedings that this case made visible in a way it rarely is. When Epstein's lawyers filed motions, they filed them with the resources to sustain a years-long litigation strategy. They filed them knowing that the opposing party, a woman who had been a teenage massage attendant at a resort hotel when she was recruited, had no comparable resources and no comparable institutional support. The legal strategy was not primarily about winning the specific motion. It was about duration, about the accumulated cost of continuing, about the calculation which Epstein's legal team understood and which his victims understood with equal clarity, that at some point the price of persistence would exceed what a person without resources could pay. Several women settled. Not because their accounts were false, not because they had been persuaded that what happened to them had not happened, because they were offered a financial settlement that came attached to a non-disclosure agreement, and the alternative to signing was more years of litigation that they could not afford, against opponents who could sustain it indefinitely, in a legal system that had already demonstrated, through the 2008 agreement, that it was capable of setting Jeffrey Epstein aside when the people around him needed it to. They signed because the system made signing the rational choice. That is the specific cruelty of it. Not that they were deceived into silence, but that they were presented with a set of options designed so that silence was the one that made sense. Some of them did not survive the waiting. This is not a rhetorical formulation. Some of the women who passed through Epstein's network, who were recruited as teenagers and spent years navigating the psychological aftermath of what had been done to them, while simultaneously being told in public forums that what had been done to them was disputed, did not reach the point where accountability became possible. The years between the 2005 investigation and the 2019 arrest, 14 years in which the network continued to operate, in which the legal agreement held, in which the institutional silence remained intact, were years that those women lived inside. Not as a background fact, as the condition of their daily lives. After Epstein's death, after the trial that would have produced public accountability dissolved overnight, there was a particular kind of secondary cruelty delivered to the women who had agreed to testify. They had been persuaded by prosecutors from the Southern District of New York that this time was different, that the legal argument was solid, that the witnesses were protected, that the evidence was sufficient and the institutional commitment was real. They had restructured their lives around the coming trial, had prepared for the exposure that testifying publicly would require, had made the decision again to put themselves in the position of the person whose account is subject to cross-examination by attorneys paid to find every inconsistency, every vulnerability, every moment where memory and record diverge. They had agreed to do that. And then, overnight, they were told it was over. Not resolved, not concluded with the accountability they had been promised. Simply over. Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction in December 2021 was presented, in some of the coverage that followed it, as a form of justice. For some of the women she had directly recruited and abused, the conviction carried meaning. It established, in a public legal proceeding, that what they had described had happened, that a jury of 12 people had heard the evidence and found it credible beyond reasonable doubt. That mattered. But Maxwell was convicted for what she had done to victims. She was not convicted, was not charged, was not tried, as an operative of a foreign intelligence service. The chain of accountability that her conviction represented stopped with her. The men she had recruited victims for, in some cases identified by name in her trial, faced no criminal proceedings. The organization she had allegedly been working for was never named in a charging document. The conviction was real. The ceiling it represented was equally real. What the cost of this operation ultimately looks like, measured against the people who paid it most directly, is this. Decades of lives shaped by the experience of being used as instruments in an intelligence operation that the people who ran it designed to be deniable. Decades of accounts given and disbelieved, or believed and set aside for reasons explained to no one. Decades of watching the men whose names appear in the depositions continue to give speeches, accept honors, hold office. And then, finally, a document release of 3 million pages that the agency responsible for it described as comprehensive, while simultaneously stating that the most significant item anyone was looking for had not been found. No client list, no record of what the cameras produced, no accounting of where the recordings went. The files were released. The question of what was done with what was captured remains, as it has always remained, inside a silence that the operation was designed, from the beginning, to be able to maintain. The women who passed through this network were not collateral damage, they were the mechanism. Without them, the cameras had nothing to record. Without the situations they were placed into, the leverage that allegedly bent federal prosecutions and shaped policy decisions and allowed a man with a forged passport in his safe to walk out of a federal facility 6 days a week for 13 months, none of that existed. They were the most essential component of the operation. They were also the people for whom the operation produced no protection, no immunity, no benefit of any kind. Only the cost. And the bill for that cost has not been paid by anyone responsible for designing what was done to them. That is not an accident of how this case concluded. It is a consequence of what the operation was built to ensure. Some settled civil suits under non-disclosure agreements that traded the right to speak for the financial stability they had never had and desperately needed. Some are still in litigation. None have received what the law, at its most foundational level, promises: a complete public accounting, in open court, of what was done to them and by whom and on whose instruction. The institutional damage sits in a specific location. The 2008 non-prosecution agreement did not happen because Alexander Acosta was corrupt or naive or incompetent. It happened because someone in the architecture surrounding Epstein was able to communicate, through channels that left no recoverable trace, that this defendant was not to be prosecuted. That communication was effective because of what the cameras had collected. Because the people who needed to stand aside understood, implicitly or explicitly, that standing aside was the price of what the cameras had not yet been used for. This is how a blackmail operation achieves its strategic purpose without ever producing a recording in public. You do not release the material. You simply allow the people who are on the material to understand that you have it, and they find reasons to make the phone call you need them to make. What you have just watched is not the story of one man's crimes. It is the story of how an intelligence service allegedly used the infrastructure of wealth, access, and recorded evidence to compromise the institutions responsible for governing the most powerful country on Earth. It is the story of how a constructed identity, a billionaire who was never a billionaire, a financier whose finances were never explained, a man whose wealth came from a source that no investigation has officially named, was placed at the center of Western elite society for 20 years. The hidden camera is not the story. The hidden camera is the mechanism. The story is what was purchased with it. What policies bent, what prosecutions stopped, what decisions were made in rooms where the person making them understood, quietly, that a recording existed and that the recording was somewhere. The 9 hard drives are in federal custody. Their contents have not been disclosed. The flight logs are public record. The court documents from the Maxwell trial are accessible. The 2024 and 2025 document releases are partially searchable. The full picture has not been published, but the outline of it is visible to anyone who looks at the confirmed facts in sequence and asks the question that nobody, in an official capacity, has been willing to answer in public. Who built this? Who ran it? And what did they do with what they collected? The questions are not closed, they belong to you now.